Have you ever been in a place so big and impressive that you thought to yourself, I really wonder how this thing is even standing? Well, today I'm going to tell you about 3 true stories how exactly places like this turn into scenes of pure horror. Now, these are some of the world's most tragic incidents, so viewers' discretion is very much advised. And after hearing about these, honestly, I wouldn't really blame you if you didn't want to go anywhere near similar structures for a really long time. Let's dive in. In July of 1981, the brand new Hyatt Regency Hotel in Kansas City, Missouri was the place to be. It was sleek, it was modern, and right in the middle of this enormous lobby were these 3 skywalks, which were actually suspended glass and steel bridges that crossed above the main atrium. And so guests could walk from one side of the hotel to another without ever touching the ground floor. On the night of July 17th, the hotel was hosting a tea dance, which was this regular Friday night event with music, drinks, and hundreds of guests. By 7 p.m. that evening, more than 1,500 people had packed into the lobby. Couples were taking the dance floor below, and the suspended walkways above the crowd swayed just slightly as people leaned against the railings, looking down at the dancers. And one of those people was Andrea Martin, a 22-year-old waitress working that dance that evening. Even though it was an extremely busy evening for her, she was still having a good time. She particularly remembered the live band playing a tune called Satin Doll and the laughter echoing up to the ceiling. It was the kind of night that makes you feel lucky to be alive. At 7:05 p.m., a man named Mark Williams, standing on the ground floor, looked up and noticed something very strange. One of the rods that held the upper walkway seemed to quiver, almost like it was breathing. He later told the investigators that it was like watching something trying not to fall. Seconds later, a loud metallic crack split through the jazz. Now, some guests standing on the 4th floor skywalk felt a sudden jolt beneath their feet. But before anyone could react, the top walkway suddenly broke free. And the blinding rain of glass and steel, it collapsed straight down onto the 2nd floor walkway below it, shearing it loose. Now, both bridges, together weighing more than 60 tons, plummeted into the packed atrium, crushing people on the dance floor and trapping dozens in a tangle of steel and concrete. The collapse took less than 4 seconds. The music stopped, the lights went out, and then silence, followed by only screams. In the chaos that followed, survivors began pulling others from the wreckage. The Kansas City Fire Department arrived within minutes, but what they saw was unlike anything they had ever trained for. There was all of this twisted metal, shattered glass, water pouring from ruptured pipes, and hundreds of injured and pinned victims everywhere they could see. The walkways had come down in a V-shape, crushing people beneath massive beams and concrete. Now, firefighters had to use hydraulic jacks to lift the wreckage, and every time they did, they would find new survivors, but also new bodies. Ambulances filled every street. Doctors set up triage stations right there in the hotel. Now, one rescuer years later said that the air smelled like a mix of perfume, dust, and blood. At one point, they actually had to shut off the building's air conditioning system, but that wasn't for comfort. It was actually because the system was sucking the oxygen away from those trapped underneath, practically suffocating them. For 12 straight hours, rescue workers toiled in the sweltering heat and darkness of that lobby. And then it was all over. But the worst part was yet to come. The body counting had to begin. And in the end, 114 people were found dead, and more than 200 others were injured, making it the deadliest structural collapse in American history up to that point. In the aftermath, the investigators combed through the wreckage and the blueprints because they wanted to get to the bottom of how this massive incident could have been even possible in the first place. But what they would end up discovering changed the entire story. So originally, each walkway was supposed to be hung from a single continuous set of steel rods that passed through the ceiling and connected all the way down to the lower levels. But during construction, the steel fabricators proposed a minor change. something they thought that would make the whole assembly easier. And so instead of one long rod, they used two shorter rods, one supporting the upper walkway and another connected to it that was supporting the lower one. And this small change meant that the upper walkway was now carrying double the weight it was designed for. So when the guys crowded onto those bridges that night, laughing, leaning and dancing, they unknowingly added just enough extra load to tear the structure apart. Now, in the years that followed, the Hyatt collapse became a defining moment for engineering ethics. The engineers who had approved the change without recalculating the load were later found negligent. The company lost its license to practice engineering in the state of Missouri. They had to pay millions in damages, and the disaster became a turning point for construction safety across the whole country. Today, the site of the old Hyatt, now the Sheraton Kansas City Hotel at Grand Center, still stands, and there's a memorial just outside the lobby honoring those who lost their lives that night. And every July, survivors and families gather to remember the victims and the rescuers who risk everything to save them. Now, if you've made it this far, then you're officially part of the Morbid archive. And that means one thing: you've got the kind of curiosity most people pretend that they don't have. So here's the deal. If you want to keep digging with me into similar stories like this one, then hit that subscribe button, because every week we open yet another file. It was June 29, 1995, a hot, sticky Friday afternoon in Seoul, South Korea. Inside the Sampoong department store, the air conditioning hummed, music played softly from overhead speakers, and the nearly 1,500 shoppers and employees moved from floor to floor. It was a payday weekend, so the perfect time to treat yourself to a new shirt, a meal, or maybe just some cool air away from the heat outside. But the Sampoong wasn't just like any mall. It was a symbol of South Korea's new prosperity. 5 gleaming stories tall, with restaurants, designer boutiques, and a marble atrium where sunlight poured through the massive windows. It had only been open 6 years, but it already was an icon, a place that whispered, "The future is here." But the reality was much, much darker. The mall shouldn't have been standing at all. When construction began in late 1980s, engineers designed the building to hold 4 stories. But the developer, Lee Jun, decided that this just wasn't enough. He wanted 5. But he didn't stop there. He also wanted a rooftop skating ring, an indulgent, heavy feature that would require major redesigns. When the engineers pushed back, warning that the added floor and ring would overstretch the structure, Lee just fired them, and then he replaced them with a team that would finally say yes to him. Now, during the mall's construction, the shortcuts began to pile up. Long bearing columns were shaved thinner, to make room for escalators. The new top floor with a skating ring was made of heavier concrete than actually planned, and the roof's air conditioning units were placed directly above the weakest part of the building. But somehow the project was still approved and then completed, and for 6 whole years the building stood tall. But behind the polished marble floors and pink tile walls, the building was cracking, literally. And then the most horrifying thing happened. By the morning of June 29, 1995, workers had noticed creaks and cracks spreading across the ceiling of the 5th floor. A maintenance man even reporting seeing chunks of plaster falling near a restaurant. The sound of popping rebar echoed like gunfire through the walls. And so that afternoon, around 1 p.m., the building's management ended up calling in engineers to come in and have a look at the place. And when they did, they only had one thing to say to Lee Jun: "You need to evacuate immediately." But to everyone's surprise, even after hearing how dire the situation was, Lee Jun just refused. The mall was packed with shoppers, and closing early meant losing a full day's of revenue. So instead, he decided to just block off the 5th floor and keep the rest of the store open. Unfortunately, this was a grave mistake. At 5 p.m., as the evening crowd began to swell, the cracks widened into full seams. The building started emitting this low groaning sound that one witness described as like a truck braking on a mountain road. Ceiling tiles fell, the lights flickered, and then silence. At 5:52 p.m., the entire south wing of the Sampoong department store collapsed. In less than 20 seconds, 3,700 tons of concrete and steel came crashing down through the atrium, pulverizing 4 floors and burying hundreds and hundreds of people beneath it. Outside, a blast of debris shattered windows across the street. The survivors described the moment like being trapped in an earthquake, but one that just wasn't stopping. Rescue teams arrived within minutes, but what they found was just a mountain of rubble. A 10-meter-high pile of twisted steel and crushed concrete, with muffled cries for help coming from deep within it. And for 5 days, rescuers dug non-stop. They used cranes, jackhammers, even their bare hands. And by the end of the first night, more than 200 people had been pulled out alive. But the deeper they went, the worse it got. And then, on July 11th, 17 days after the collapse, they heard a voice. It was very faint, almost lost beneath all the rubble, but it was unmistakably human. So they quickly began digging, trying to get to the source of it. And to everyone's surprise, they found Park Seon-hyun, a 19-year-old sales clerk. She had survived in this tiny pocket of air, drinking rainwater that dripped from concrete cracks. And 17 days in the dark, but she was still alive. But unfortunately, she was one of the last ones. When the operation finally ended, 502 people were dead, and more than 900 were injured. Investigators later discovered that the building had failed exactly as predicted. The extra floor, the heavy air conditioners, the removed columns, all combined into this massive structural death sentence. Lee Jun and several others were arrested and convicted of criminal negligence. The Sampoong disaster forced South Korea to overhaul its entire building safety code. But for the survivors, the memory of that day never left them. Many couldn't enter tall buildings again. One rescuer said that the smell of dust and concrete still made his stomach turn years later. Now, as for the site today, there is actually a small memorial that has been built up. And every June on the 29th, families gather, lay flowers, and remember a day when a shopping trip turned into one of the darkest days in the nation's history. When a single man's greed weighed more than a human's life, and unfortunately, gravity called his bluff. Death moved quietly, not in a flash of fire, but as a cloud you couldn't see until it was already inside of you. Bhopal was a busy, working-class city right in the middle of India. Just outside its crowded neighborhood sat this Union Carbide India Limited pesticide plant. It was this American-owned facility that made insecticides for the local farms. And inside of that plant were these massive storage tanks full of methyl isocyanate, or MIC, which is a chemical so toxic that just a single drop on your skin could cause horrible blisters and even blindness. Now, obviously, because of how dangerous this substance was, the plant did have its safety systems in place. In theory. But by 1984, the business got really bad. Profits were massively down, and cost-cutting had kind of become the rule. Alarms were left unfixed. The refrigeration unit, meant to keep the MIC cool, was shut off to save money. And safety drills stopped altogether. And then, around 11 p.m. that Sunday night, workers noticed something very strange, and the sight of it chilled them to the core. There was a chemical leak in one of the MIC storage tanks. Now, water had somehow entered the tank, possibly through a faulty valve, but this was actually really bad news. You see, when water reacts with MIC, it produces heat, and a lot of it. And so, inside of that sealed steel tank, pressure built fast. At 12:40 a.m., the safety valve just blew open, and a dense white cloud began rolling out of the factory, carrying 40 tons of toxic gas into the night air. But this wasn't the worst. Despite of how incredibly dangerous this was, there were no alarms, no sirens, no evacuation orders. And so the gas just spread silently across the city, hugging the ground because it was heavier than air. And so it crept through the narrow streets into homes where entire families were sleeping. And within minutes, people woke up coughing, choking, clawing at their throats. Their eyes burned, their lungs felt like they were on fire. Mothers were grabbing their children and running away. But the more that they run, the harder they breathe. And so the faster the poison worked. In hospitals across the city, this unbelievable chaos erupted. Staff had no idea what chemical they were dealing with because Union Carbide never shared its formulas with the local authorities, and so nobody really knew what they could be potentially up against. And so they tried everything: oxygen, steroids, ice water, milk, anything to relieve the agony, but nothing worked. By dawn, thousands were dead. Cows, dogs, even birds lay scattered in the streets. But the gas kept just moving, and by the end of the first day, over 3,000 people were confirmed dead. And in the weeks that followed, that number clinged to more than 15,000, with hundreds of thousands of injured. Doctors later said that the gas turned into acid inside of their lungs, eating them from the inside out. Some went blind, others developed chronic breathing problems that just lasted for decades. Now, as for the company responsible for this, Union Carbide executives tried brushing the whole incident off by calling it a tragic accident at first. But when the investigators arrived, what they found wasn't an accident at all. The factory's entire safety systems, like scrubbers, flare towers, and water sprays, well, they were either offline, broken, or too small to handle the leak. The company also had ignored warnings from engineers about the corrosion and dangerous storage practices within the facility, and the plant had been built next to densely populated neighborhoods, despite regulations meant to prevent exactly that. And so in 1989, the company agreed to pay $470 million in compensations, which really just was a fraction of what the survivors needed as medical care. In 2001, the company was acquired by Dow Chemical, which has always denied further responsibility. And meanwhile, the abandoned plant still stands, and inside, the tanks are empty, but the soil and the groundwater still remain poisoned. And here's the scary part. Children born nearby today still suffer from birth defects linked to the contamination. And so for Bhopal, the tragedy never ended, it just became quieter. Now every year, survivors gather for a candlelight march through the city, carrying photographs of those who died that night. And some wear gas masks, and many carry these signs written in Hindi and English saying, "We still can't breathe." Until next time.